Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Dynamics 365 Tech Talk, Warehouse Management, Module Implementation, Best Practices. My name is Evan, and I'll be your moderator today. We are broadcasting this web conference through Teams Live events, and the audio can be heard through your device speakers. Today's web conference is being recorded on behalf of the Microsoft Corporation, and by participating in the session using Microsoft Teams, your name, email address, phone number, and/or title may be viewable by other session participants. If you do not consent to being a part of a recorded session, please disconnect at this time. The recording will be available on the Tech Talks Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. If you have questions for the presenters or need support, please use the Q&A panel located on the right side of your screen. Our presenters will be responding to your questions throughout and at the end of the event. Thank you for your patience during these announcements. Now let's get started. Presenting for us today from Microsoft, we have Murch, Senior R&D Solution Architect, Zach Greenvoss, Principal R&D Solution Architect, and Nicole Gump, Senior Program Manager. Aaron, over to you.
Great, thanks, Evan. Hi, everyone. Yes, as Evan mentioned, my name is Aaron Murch. I'm a solution architect on the Fast Track team at Microsoft for Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations. I have some colleagues joining me as well, Zach and Nicole. They'll be helping answer questions behind the scenes throughout the presentation for me. And hopefully we might have a little extra time at the end to answer any questions that you might have as well. So from an agenda perspective, what we want to get covered here today is going over a few tips and tricks, do's and don'ts around the implementation of the warehouse and transportation management modules in Dynamics 365 for supply chain management or finance and operations, review testing best practices related to the modules, discuss additional considerations for large and complex implementations, and as I mentioned, hopefully you have a little extra time at the end for question and answers as well. All right, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and just jump right in here. So related to implementation best practices, I have a few slides on some configurations and usability related to the warehouse and transportation management modules. First point I want to make here as it relates to usability within the application is I say, based off of feedback that we've gotten from customers in the past, we do recommend that you try to minimize the number of different warehouses you set up at a physical site. So it's not uncommon for us to see customers that have 7, 8, 9 different warehouses for a physical location or a physical site. Pretty soon you have quality control warehouses, raw material warehouses, production warehouses, finished goods warehouses, bulk storage warehouses, etc. And what that ends up leading to from a usability perspective is these handheld device users then have to try to maintain or remember exactly where they're at in a warehouse, log out of one warehouse, log into another, remember that they're in the right warehouse before they start transactions, etc. Pretty soon you're having to log in and out of multiple warehouses just to move product from one area of the warehouse to another. So what I say is, or what we recommend here is that you try to minimize that as much as possible. From a usability perspective and user perspective on a mobile device, it's easiest to just log into a single warehouse, stay there, and then also longer term that also cuts down on the amount of configuration and maintenance that you need to do within the application as well, right? So instead of having to set up a lot of these different wave templates or location directives or any number of things. From a system configuration perspective, you just have to set that up for a single warehouse that's already shared out. And then also if you're shipping out of a single warehouse, it makes those transportation management module setups a lot easier as well. You're not having to set up a bunch of those route plans or route guides for multiple different warehouses as well then. Second point that I wanted to make is do try to minimize the number of mobile device menu items as well, or at least take into consideration what the warehouse workers are going to see and try to minimize that potential for error. So that's kind of goes back to the first point, right? Is if your warehouse workers are having to remember to log in and out of multiple different warehouses throughout the day, or even just to complete a single transaction, it makes the overall user experience, a lot more cumbersome and prone to error in the system. So what I always say is, try to keep that end user focus in mind as you're building out your menu items are your your main menu items, or your mobile device menu options for those users, so that they don't have to, from a usability perspective, they don't have to remember. It's not cumbersome. They don't have to click through a bunch of different screens to try to get to where they're trying to go. A lot of times this kind of grows organically as throughout the implementation process itself, so you have requirements, pretty soon you have menu items for each of your different requirements, and pretty soon you have hundreds of different menu options for these users. So it's always best to try to minimize that as much as possible, set it up, make it intuitive and friendly for those users that are going to be using the mobile devices. Next thing I want to talk about is wave processing. First point here is do try to utilize min-max replenishments in conjunction with demand replenishments to improve those wave processing times. So we have multiple different options as it relates to replenishment templates. So we have min-maxes. We also have like a order and load, I believe are the two other ones off the top of my head. So when you set up those demand-based replenishments, what ends up happening is, as part of the wave processing itself, what the system's going to do is go try to allocate those goods. Then it's going to also create that replenishment work at the same time that it's executing that and building out that replenishment work behind the scenes from a system perspective. And what that does is just increases overall load on that wave processing overall in the system, right? So what we recommend that you do is try to set up your min-max replenishments as well, because those actually run as a separate batch job. So it's outside of that standard wave processing behind the scenes. So what you can do then is segregate that work, run it as a batch job, and then your wave processing times would be much more streamlined in those examples. So what we recommend is, if you do set up min-max fulfillment levels in a warehouse, let's say your pick faces, you have bulk storage areas, and then you have pick faces, and you need to move product from bulk storage into where orders are actually going to get picked for fulfillment. What you do is you'd set up these batch jobs to run, again, depending on the flow of the work in the warehouse, maybe a handful of times, 2, 3, 4 times a day, we'd set up these min-maxes. And then the other thing to keep in mind is that we now have a replenish to max feature as well. So what you can do is, as minimums are hit when we're running these jobs, we can turn on that replenish to max. And what's going to happen is that we'll get work created for these warehouse personnel to go take product out of these bulk storage areas and fill up those pick faces to the maximum for order fulfillment. Next thing as it relates to wave processing is do try to utilize the multiple wave processing tasks to improve that wave processing performance times. So there is a tech talk with additional details on this. Again, this is newer functionality. I would say within the last 18 months or so, we now do have the ability to handle multiple wave processing threads simultaneously. So what this would allow you to do is, instead of having a long sequential wave processing, we can actually break that up into smaller chunks and run multiple at a time, and that'll just decrease overall wave processing times. And this becomes important when you're dealing with those large scale implementations, hundreds of thousands of orders that you're having to release out to the warehouse to get work created for simultaneously. Next thing I want to talk about is from a performance perspective. It was not uncommon historically when folks were first starting to learn this module and figure out how it worked, is that they turn on all of this logging within the parameters without understanding or realizing that there's actually cleanup jobs that also have to be set up to clear out those logs periodically. So what was happening is that we'd be seeing customers that all of their warehouse management log tables are some of the largest in the database, so gigabytes worth of historical work creation history sitting in a database and causing performance issues over time. So if you do enable any of that logging in the system, also recommend that you do enable these cleanup jobs within the module as well to make sure that you're purging out that information on a periodic basis so those tables are not growing exponentially. As it relates to that topic, one of the things that we recommend here is that don't leave those history logs enabled unnecessarily in the production environment, right? So from a system perspective, those log tables are meant for troubleshooting purposes, right? So as you're configuring the system, getting things enabled, etc., checking to see if everything is working as expected, if you're running into any errors that you need to go back through and try to troubleshoot as to why things are not working correctly, you can reference those logs. But once you get things set up and working in the system, at that point in time, it's negligible whether you would actually need to keep any of that history or those creation logs at that point in time. So really only leave those enabled if there's a true purpose for what you're doing with those logs in those production environments. Next thing we want to discuss is the new deferred put framework, or again, newer deferred put framework. It's been out for, well, some transactions have been available for close to a year now at this point in time, I want to say. So we have in the past seen customers have performance issues on those handheld devices with large number of transaction records that need to be processed. So examples that I've seen is if batch or serial tracking is enabled, or also if you have a lot of items on let's say a single container that you're moving from a packing station to an outbound dock, etc. Anything where we'd have to queue up a lot of warehouse inventory transaction records that need to post simultaneously in the system. So there is a throughput rate for processing those transactions in the system. And so without the deferred put framework, the user experience on the handheld devices is that they need to, on the handheld, they would hit done or go or execute on whatever they're trying to do. And then they'd have to wait for all of those inventory transaction records to get posted into the database before they could move on and start doing their next task within the warehouse. And this could take several minutes, depending on the amount of unique inventory transaction posts that need to be made. This could take minutes, to several minutes. And so what the deferred put framework does is it actually allows these processes to get queued up into the deferred put framework, and then they'll be executed behind the scenes. So what it'll do is it'll free up the handheld devices much quicker. So the end user, all they have to do is hit done or end or execute on their handheld device, and it's just going to write that into that queue. And it's going to free up that handheld device much more quickly for them. And then behind the scenes, the system can catch up and post all of those inventory transaction records over the next several minutes. But the warehouse worker can continue on to the next step or the next stage or the next thing that they needed to do in the warehouse itself. Currently supported transactions for this is a put to staging or an outbound dock. Also support inbound put operations, and then inventory movements are coming later this fall. Again, with disclaimer, that's the current plan or approach, and that is subject to change until it's actually available. But that's the rough timeline of when we're expecting the inventory movements functionality to be available as well. Final thing as it relates to the just configuration and usability is I say do join the Yammer group that's out there for the WMS, TMS, WHS modules within the application. So this Yammer group has been out there for several years now. It's a great source of information for customers, partners such as yourselves to post questions, get answers, review historical questions that are out there. We also have a bunch of our folks from the product team are out on this as well, answering questions. And we're also posting out announcements for, let's say, a newsletter that we're posting out gets posted to this site. And then also if we have any upcoming workshops, we're posting that as well all out on this Yammer group. So if you have not yet joined it, I will be sharing out this deck. You'll have access to it at the end of this once it gets posted up onto the TechTalk site. So you can just follow that link there. and that'll get you that Yammer group, and you can go ahead and get signed up. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to talk about here today is around testing strategies. So for those of you not familiar with the Fast Track team and our role at Microsoft is we assist customers in their implementation of Dynamics 365. So we have various different teams across our Dynamics 365 product offerings. And one of the main things that we're working with customers is around testing of the system and preparing for go live for our customers that we're helping support. So a lot of the things that we're talking about on a day-to-day basis is with our customers around testing strategies and how best to test systems and ensure that they are ready for go live. Testing can get broken down into kind of these main buckets here that I'll be talking through. And then we'll be spending additional time on each of these different types of testing and what it is and best practices specifically around the warehouse and transportation management areas of the implementation. All right, so the first set of testing that is typically happening on an implementation project is what we call unit testing. So this would be testing of specific requirements. So as part of the beginning of the project, you're typically working, if you're a partner, you're working with your customers, or if you are the customer, you're working with your end users or the users of the application, and you're gathering all of the information, what is everything that the system needs to do for our company, right? Or what does everything the system need to do for my customer if you're a partner? And so what you'll do is you'll gather all of those different requirements, and then you'll want to go ahead and disposition those requirements as a fit or a gap, and then you would test those out, right? So if it's a fit, then you just go ahead and configure the system, and then you test out, ensure that that requirement works, right? So it's single function, typically a single function within an overall workflow. And then it's also important to consider any type of edge cases or any unexpected input as well, right? So don't just focus on what the system needs to do, also consider what the system needs to do if something goes wrong as part of this, if somebody hits the wrong button or enters the wrong information, etc., or what sort of error messages do we need to receive as part of these processes as well. So just make sure you keep that in mind. In order to help facilitate this unit testing within the application, there's a few different tools we make available from Microsoft. First is Azure DevOps. So if you're familiar, with the Dynamics 365 implementations, what's going to happen is that's going to link to an LCS site or a lifecycle services site behind the scenes. And then you also have the ability then to link your Azure DevOps to your LCS environments, etc. So you can do your integrations with your business process models, with your business process libraries. You can also do your task recordings and create task recordings and task guides within the D365 application. And then you can also set up test suites for tracking of those unit testing within Azure DevOps as well. And these are all going to synchronize and integrate between your Dynamics 365, your LCS, and Azure DevOps. So that's a great tool out of the box that helps keep track of where you're at from a total number of unit tests that need to be run, as well as progress for each of those different tests that have been run in the system. The other thing that's available, let's say, as I mentioned, you have requirements, you could have fits or gaps. If you do have some of those gap requirements and you're writing extensions or customizing the solution, another great tool that developers or technical folks can focus on as well is we do make available all of our standard Microsoft acceptance test libraries. So these are essentially the set of steps or the set of tests that can be automatically run within Visual Studio against all of our predefined tests from a Microsoft perspective. So as you're developing new functionality, you can run it against our standard ATL libraries to ensure that your code doesn't break any of our standard functionality out of the box, etc. There is a TechTalk available on this. So if you are more on the technical side and you want to get additional information, there is a TechTalk out there as well from last year where we talk about these acceptance test libraries and what they're useful for. Specifically for the warehouse or transportation management modules, as it relates to unit testing, There are still two different options out there for you from a handheld device perspective. We have the application, the app or the mobile app that can be installed on Android or Windows-based devices. So on laptops, handheld scanners, Android phones, etc., you can install the app. And then you also have what I call the emulator, which is that web browser. So there's a specific URL that you can type into your D365 environment, and then you would access the mobile device menu options via a web browser. So there are two different options available. I just make sure I call out the point here is that even though the menu items themselves are going to be the same across both of the options here, there is slight variations to the processing of how things are handled behind the scenes technically. And so it's always best to make sure that if you're planning on using the mobile app, while it might be nice to use the emulator during testing to set up on, let's say, like your super users or your consultant laptops versus having to install the app everywhere and try to keep it up to date. While it might be a quick fix for that, there are differences. So make sure that you are doing especially if you're customizing anything, make sure that you're doing your final testing within the app itself. Don't just rely on the emulator for all your testing before go live and then go live with the app, because you might run into some errors there. Next in the hierarchy of testing, so once you get through individual requirements testing, then you'd move into what we call process testing. So that would be an end-to-end flow. So let's say from a unit test perspective, we might have a requirement is that ability to add a customer to a sales order, right, is our requirement. The next step up in the chain is a process testing, and that would be the entire order management business process flow, right? Can we get orders into the system? From adding customers, adding items, getting pricing, setting delivery dates, et cetera, everything that needs to go into creating an order into the system. We always recommend from a Microsoft perspective that this is done on a Tier 2 plus environment. There's additional details on these testing approaches in additional tech talks, but just be aware that Tier 2 plus environments are those environments where we have our application components separate from the SQL Server components. And so this would basically be, any of those sandbox environments, Microsoft managed sandbox environments that are available as part of your subscription that you have, right? That we always recommend that the process testing be run there versus what we call Tier 1 are those developer boxes where all application and SQL components reside on a single box. Again, there's slight differences technically, so you want to make sure that you're doing any of this elevated type testing on these Tier 2 environments, because that's what we consider to be production-like environments where those components are separated out. And the other thing to keep in mind then with process testing is that you utilize real data. So always start your data migration activities early in the process of the project, right? As soon as you gather requirements and you move into the configuration phase, make sure that you're also simultaneously working on getting your data cleaned up and ready, because you don't have until your go live date to get your data ready, right? What you want to have happening is that you're testing those data and you're having multiple runs of testing your data throughout the implementation life cycle, right? So as you're moving through each of your different testing phases, that you have another round of data, you can cleanse, you can figure out what's wrong with the data, if you need to make any changes, et cetera, that you can be doing that throughout your testing cycles as well, versus waiting till the end. Next, in the hierarchy of testing, so once we get through a single requirement, and then we get into our process testing, once we get past a single business process, we get into systems or integrations testing, as we call it. So this would be stringing, end-to-end processes together in the system. So not only, again, just to further elaborate on my example I've been using of order management, now we would go from order management all the way to collecting payment from customers, right? So we'd be entering orders into the system. We'd be executing pick, pack, ship operations in the warehouse. We'd then be doing accounts receivable and collecting customer payments, right? So the complete process, making sure that works. And as part of that complete process, we might have additional integrations or ISVs in play as well. And it's at this point in time that we want to make sure that we have all of our application components in place and we're testing everything simultaneously. So making sure at this point in time, this is where we're typically branching out from our core product team. It's not just our consultants, our power users. We're also starting to then get our end users, starting to get possibly some end user involvement as well, or branching out that product or the implementation team as well at this point in time. And then just a final note, as I mentioned, ADO is the acronym for Azure DevOps, right? So just making sure that we're setting up our test plans and we can set up scenarios for testing of these of this systems or integration testing, and track that within Azure DevOps and track overall progress as well. So again, just circling back to that same Azure DevOps tool, great for monitoring and reporting on overall testing of the application or the system. Next topic that I want to talk about here, and what we'll be spending a lot of time on today, or getting additional detail as it relates to the warehouse and transportation management modules, is around the performance testing of the environment. So this is a required step before you go live on the system, right? So don't just stop at ensuring that, you know, if you have requirements for the ability to enter sales orders into the system, don't just stop at, you know, if you get one sales order entered into the system, don't just stop there, right? Now we need to check for performance and load on the system. So this is where it becomes very important that you go out and gather, you know, transaction volume estimates, and then you run that through the system, and we try to scale that. We test the system at scale before you go live as well, to ensure that we're not going to have any performance issues when you go live. Right. So in as an example, you know, if the customer is processing, you know, let's say 5,000 sales orders a day, how best can we automate that process of entering 5,000 sales orders in on any given day and processing through the system, and ensure that all of our various integrations, customizations, as well as the standard product offering will scale up for that sort of volume that we're pushing through the system. And again, there's additional tech talks on this topic, so I won't go into full details on what performance testing is and how best to execute that. Again, just go out to the TechTalk site, and there's a series of tech talks on performance and planning for it and how best to execute that. But just keep in mind, you know, start early in the process. That's probably the biggest takeaway from the recommendations that we make from a Microsoft perspective related to performance testing is, you know, start early, give yourself time to tune. You know, performance testing tends to be an iterative process, you know, where if you're not hitting, you set up your benchmarks. If the system's not hitting those benchmarks in terms of timeframes from a performance perspective, go back through, find what's taking the longest, fix that, move on to the next thing, move on to the next. So just make sure you start early so that you have time to make those changes, and you don't have to, you know, the worst case scenario is that you wait like a week before go live and then you start running some performance testing. And now if you're not hitting your performance benchmarks, you know, now you're basically looking at a delayed go live because of it. So make sure that you give yourself plenty of time that you can address issues should you find any. So from a standard system perspective, we do have some automated tools to help in that. We have our Perf SDK, or Performance SDK, that we can actually script out. So what you can do is go through and do your task recordings within the application and save those as basically developer version that can be imported into Visual Studio, and you can automate then. So you can scale out and simulate user load in the system. So that's a great tool for expanding out, saying what does sales order entry from a performance perspective look like for one user? Then we go to 5, 10, 100, 1,000, you know, depending on the size or the complexity of your implementation, you can scale those out, and we can simulate that. And then we can go back and look at how the system is responding to that sort of load. So those are all great tools, using those task recorder and automating that. You know, again, I mentioned the Perf SDK, that's the Microsoft tool. Otherwise, there's a bunch of other third-party tools out there as well that we've seen our customers use. and it's all great. And basically, what from a fast track perspective, our only recommendation is that you find a tool, use it, and make sure that you have confidence in the solution before you expect to go live. As it relates to WMS performance testing, some of those tools are not going to be available to us, right? So we're not going to be able to necessarily go out and do our task recordings and make those available to be scripted and automated at user load. So we do have to do things a little more manual from a warehousing perspective. And so this typically means that we identify a set of users that we're going to target to help us in testing the solution before go live. And how to set up this performance testing from a warehouse management perspective is basically what we're going to be walking through here next. But what you need to do is identify your scenarios that you want to performance test from a warehousing perspective, determine those user roles within the warehouse, document those expected transactions and load rates. We need to generate our data so that it's available for our users. And there's a couple of different tools available there. A data management framework, which if we wanted to import data, or we also have the data expansion tool within the application itself that would go ahead and let us set up, those mass numbers of sales orders. Let's say if we're going to want to test our pick, pack, ship operations, we could go in and within the data expansion tool, go out and create like 500 sales orders within the application if we wanted. And then the final step would be to actually execute those tests. So we'll take a look at each of these steps individually here next. So first step, as I mentioned, is determining those scenarios. So what's your peak load scenarios? Here's an example of a customer. They said peak, what they would expect to be their peak volume at time frame would be if something were to happen and the system goes down and there's, let's say, a critical integration goes down that they can't no longer receive orders for, let's say, 30 minutes. So what would that look like in order to try to get caught back up? So that was the scenario they identified. This could be any number of things. You could do more of like a day-to-day basis. Let's say that most of the orders come in between noon and 1, and we have 1,000 sales orders come in during that time frame, and that all need to get picked, packed, and shipped, etc. Whatever it is, just make sure that you define those scenarios. And then next, for each of those different scenarios, that's where those transaction volume estimates become important, right? So for each of those for that scenario, you need to determine each of those different user roles to fulfill that scenario, and then the transaction rate at which it must be completed in, right? So in this scenario, it's actually a system goes down and it's a receiving process that they're scripting for here, right? So based off of our transaction volume estimates, here's all of the different individuals within the warehouse that are going to be involved in this scenario in order to get it executed. And based off of our transaction volume estimates, this is the rate at which they need to execute their job, right? So it becomes very specific, very data driven for the scenario, as well as each of those different roles and the rate at which all of those operations need to be completed in. So at that point in time, you basically have your benchmarks, right? So this is from a system performance perspective, this is the throughput at which we need to be able to execute using Dynamics 365 in our warehouse, right? So once you have all of those roles and those benchmark transaction times, the next thing you're going to do is create instructions for each of those different roles. So again, this would be more or less your task guide or your task recording. In a warehouse mobile app environment. So what are those specific steps? This is part end user training, part scripting of the scenario. So making sure that everyone that is going to be involved as part of this testing knows exactly what they need to do. And then the final step here, as from a preparation perspective, would be that we have unprocessed work available for each of those different users. So again, in my example, if it's 1,000 sales orders in an hour, what we need to do is make sure that we have 1,000 sales orders available, right? So either, again, as I mentioned, you can either import that in. If you have integrations, you can run it through your integration easy enough. Or we also have that data expansion tool as well for you if you need. So at this point in time, you basically have everything you would need. Typically, this is off hours time, so outside of the day-to-day operations of the warehouse. that this is typically getting run. However, if you have availability or if you have a slow season or something like that where you have workers available as part during the day, then you could certainly run it then. I don't know if I go as far as to say it's a best practice, but it definitely helps to have like a war room type environment, or where a consolidated area where everyone that is going to be executing the test can be located somewhat near each other. Or I've also seen this work well across teams, where I've had customers that have, multiple warehouses all doing this kind of simultaneously, and they're checking warehouse processing times across all of their different warehouses and sites. And, they'll just basically set up Teams calls and make sure that everybody has the ability to communicate. You have your IT folks checking, monitoring servers and that sort of thing, as well as handheld device performance. And then you're getting feedback real time from all of the users as well. It works well. Here it also shows if it's helpful for the individuals, you can also set up these stations and you can help them conceptualize exactly what they're doing in the scenario, what their role is. And, even though you're sitting at this table over here, just envision that you're in this area of the warehouse and this is what you're doing. This is your role in this test, right? And so then it's just running the test at that point in time, right? So that's where you'd bring in your users. You'd have your so we have our benchmark times based off our scenarios. We know exactly where we need to be when in this process, and then it just flows through, each of the different roles, right? And so you can say, grab your first set of 10 orders, get that process through the system, and work that through. And based off of our benchmark times, we know roughly where we need to be and when, right? And so you'd script out as part of preparing for your actual stress test. Make sure that you have those benchmark times identified, and those are your like I said, those are your benchmark times, and then you would be recording actual times against those, right? And at the end of this exercise, you'd basically be able to go back and look at your environment monitoring, make sure that your servers were able to hold up appropriately, make sure that your handheld devices were able to keep up, make sure that your wireless access points in your warehouse were able to keep up, etc. Right? We're testing all of that simultaneously. And if we don't hit benchmarks, then we need to go back through and analyze, what broke down in the process. And if we're not hitting benchmarks, how critical is that to our go live? Would that be considered, are we seeing like go live blocker type issues as part of this testing or not? And then also, do we need to go back through, is it customizations holding us up, et cetera? Do we need to redesign something that we put together here in order to make sure that we hit our benchmarks? So that's everything related to the performance testing with the handheld within the warehouse itself. The next thing, once you get through all of that, once you start hitting your benchmarks, you're comfortable. We no longer, the business signs off essentially on the solution at that point in time, saying that we are able to execute as a business. This new system is not going to, we have no issues with going live with the new system. There's nothing preventing us from being able to go live with the new system in Dynamics 365. It's at that point in time then that you would be requesting out that production environment. You're now ready for go live. So you'd go ahead and request that production environment, and what you get back from Microsoft is a blank production environment, right? So you need to do all of those steps of our activities to prepare that production environment to get it ready for go live. And so from a fast track perspective, what we recommend is that you actually execute a mock go live at that point in time. So this is essentially a dry run of preparing that production environment. It allows everyone that's going to be involved in preparing that environment a practice round of making sure that they know exactly what they need to do, right? So moving configurations from, let's say if we have a gold configuration environment, move that up to our production environment, running our data migrations, going through repointing if we have any integrations or certification, certificate updates that we need to make, et cetera, that we have kind of all of that documented. And this goes into what we call a cutover plan. So basically what you do is you'd have your cutover plan, all of those steps are activities that need to be run. You'd execute all of those, get a good test. You also have the ability to run a day in a life test. So where previously we're looking at like max performance or load on the system, a day in the life actually tries to sequence it out via like a real world or real life example of, at 6 a.m. we're doing this, at 7 a.m. we're doing this, at 8 a.m. we're doing this, etc. We kind of flow through, and it's basically a day in the life. Like, imagine that this is the day we're actually going live in the system. Let's work through these set of activities in the system, make sure everything is still working as expected in this production environment. And then finally, you can also do any final performance validations of that production environment. So a lot of the times, typically what you're doing is you're running those performance tests in a tier 2+ environment, right? And you're getting those final performance metrics. What you might want to do then as well is make sure that you rerun some of those final performance tests in that production environment. Make sure you're seeing the same results in that production environment as you saw in those final performance test environments. And this is also then a good point as well as, again, this can be throughout the implementation, but for sure, you definitely want to do this before you go live, which is, get out there, make sure that everything you're doing is not in that conference room or in that set of, fold up tables as you saw in that example, right? Make sure that you're getting out on the production floor, seeing how the warehouse operates, making sure you understand how the production floor operates, etc. Do that final double check of everything in the system, right? Making sure that all your location labels have been applied as expected, that, double check inventory counts in the system, make sure that those aren't way off, make sure that if you're moving to pallet labels or license plate labels, box labels, etc., if they haven't done that in the past and they're doing it now, making sure that all of those got applied as expected. And then finally, also just, double check of the devices themselves, right? Do we have wireless coverage? Are the handhelds working as expected also, etc. So it's just that final double check. Make sure you're doing, don't make any assumptions before go live. I've just seen, throughout, it's almost every go live, there's something that happens out on that warehouse floor where there is an assumption made. And now you have to account for it after go live, and it just slows things down and makes things that much more difficult at the time of go live. And so that was everything basically to get us up to the go live, right? So at this point in time, we've done all of our testing, done our performance testing, we requested the production environment, we've prepared that, everything is still on track, we go live. Now you need to shift your focus to regression testing, right? It's at this point in time, we're in the continuous update mode of Dynamics 365, right? So near monthly updates to the system, and only one version is only going to be supported for, let's say a 2 to 3 month time period. So we need to keep in mind that we're going to have this continuous cycle of updates to the software that we need to account for, and then we need to set up testing plans for as well. And this is what we call regression testing, right? So does the new application version break anything that we had previously that was already working? So that's regression testing. So since this is such a continuous activity now in the Dynamics 365 world, is you want to try to reduce those manual testing efforts as much as possible. So one way that you can do that, the Microsoft tool that we make available for you is the RSAT tool, or Regression Suite Automation tool. This allows you to go through, take those task recordings that you're making within the application of executing a recording specific processes or steps within the application to do, to execute business operations. What you can do is you can then take those recordings and bring them into the RSAT tool, and we can basically, it's like a version of like robotic process automation where we're going to go through and we're going to automate those set of activities, and then we're going to give you a pass fail result of that activity, right? So it's just a single user, I was able to enter sales orders without issue on application version 12. Can I also now enter sales orders in application version 13 next month as well, right? So we can we can script out and record those set of activities and drop it into the RSAT tool, and it can automate that for us. So again, there's tech talks on this with additional details of how you set it up, but just know that it is an automated tool. And again, up to probably 12 to 18 months ago, we actually didn't have support for the warehouse mobile app in the RSAT tool. I Thanks to the work that Zach has done, though, we have now made a warehouse app task validation tool available for that warehouse regression testing as well. So now you can actually execute complete business process flows end to end with those warehousing app steps involved as well. So you can go from entering orders to picking, packing, shipping, to invoicing customers, to receiving payment, etc. You can automate that entire process flow and run that automatically, and you can get pass-fail results. So it just streamlines that regression testing on a monthly basis for you. And so you can see here, there's a link for that warehouse app task validation tool as well. There's a link. There was a tech talk that Zach hosted on that as well, if you need additional information how to set that up and how that works. Okay, so that's everything I wanted to go over from a testing perspective. Final topic that I wanted to cover here for today's call was all around additional considerations as it relates to what we call complex implementations. So this would typically be, a multi-site, multi-warehouse, large kind of global coverage with warehouses that have, labor planning involved, as well as like completely dedicated individuals that are basically at 100% capacity, right? So we have labor force is based off of expected demand in that warehouse, and they are 100% utilized, and there's not a lot of downtime. We don't have a lot of standing around, etc. So I'm just going to run through a set of additional kind of considerations that we need to take into play for those types of large complex type implementations of the warehouse management module. First thing is from a fast track perspective, one of the first things that we're looking at is a risk of a project, right? Like, how risky is this project, and are there ways that we can help reduce risk? So this might include, could we start with a few smaller warehouses to start with, have them go live, make sure everything is working as expected, try to iron out some of the bugs or some of the things that were not considered before we go live, get those all taken care of up front before we start bringing on the entire company. Is that possible versus a big bang, which would mean, all warehouses, all users simultaneously going live. Next thing, or we could take a look at maybe a subset of business processes. Maybe we just go live with warehousing operations, not production or transportation, or vice versa. Can we layer in the processes that we're turning on? Or is there any sort of business seasonality that we need to take into account? Is there a busy season and a slow season? And can we go live, at the beginning of slow season to make sure that we get everything ironed out before we really start hitting the system hard during our busy season? And from a risk perspective, just keep this in mind as it relates to warehouse management implementations, is that things start to fail, or if there's problems with the implementation, things were not thought through all the way or tested completely before you go live, that has huge impacts to the business operations when things start to go badly. One of the things that I make sure that people are aware of is that these issues always will tend to snowball on you, right? So if you only get 80% of your orders out today, you're going to need to get 100% of your orders out tomorrow, plus the other 20% that you didn't get out the day before, right? So now not only do you have a new system that you might be having issues with, but now you have 120%. Now you have additional, all of those benchmarks and those timings that you thought you needed from a system processing perspective all go out the window, because now you need to speed up, right? You need to try to catch back up. And if you go 2 days in a row with only hitting 80%, now that third day is an almost insurmountable amount of work that you need to get out the warehouse. So just keep that in mind. Make sure that as part of your testing that you truly are ready for go live, because if you're not, you're going to see a lot of issues very quickly, and it's going to have large impacts. And then keep in mind that there might not always be a quick or easy answer to the problem, right? It could take weeks or months to determine a solution to some of these things. So it's something that you have to live with. So just make sure that you're doing your testing and you're prepared for a go live. Next one that I say here is a common mistake that we'll see with our partners is that they tend to focus on the software too much as part of these large complex implementations, right? It's not just enough to know Dynamics 365 for a lot of these implementations. As we mentioned the requirements, we can gather benchmarks, etc. But, to a certain extent, you also need to be bringing experience and knowledge of the industry and the warehouse and common warehousing to these implementations as well, right? Because you don't necessarily know what you've designed is going to hold up, right? So you can test everything, but there might be surprises for you once you actually go live. So one of the examples I have is like an implementation we saw where a customer has a lot of new products on an annual basis. So they're getting a lot of new products into the system. And what got missed is, they have bulk storage areas and they had pick faces, and they had pick faces set up for all of this product, but they had missed during the requirements gathering that at some point in time they're actually going to have to clear out some of this old product to make room for the new product so that it could get brought over to your pick locations again. And so since they missed that step, what they had is they had all of this old product taking up all of their pick faces, and as new product was coming in the door, and that's the hottest and latest thing with the highest volume, they had nowhere to put that product. There was no physical space for this product to go in these pick locations. So then pretty soon, now you have all of your warehouse workers are having to go into these bulk storage areas, cut open boxes, start picking directly from the boxes because there's nowhere on your shelves to put it. So it's just things like that where you might want an outside. It either could be an outside consultant or just making sure, someone that's not involved in the day-to-day of the project, just making sure that you've thought through all of the ramifications of the design decisions that you've made and ensuring that you haven't forgotten anything as part of the setup of the system. Next topic here is exception management. So just making sure that you don't just train the warehouse workers on the happy path, like here's A to B, first I pick it, then I pack it, then I put it on the truck and I ship it and everything goes out, and then we post packing slip and everything's done, right? Make sure you figure out what you're going to do for exceptions management as well, right? Let's say that I go to pick 10 of an item and there's only 9 on the shelf. What is that user going to do? What happens then? Or let's say that truck gets a mile down the road. We've already posted everything into the system. We've created our packing slips, etc. Truck gets a mile down the road and we figure out that it's overweight and now it has to come back and we have to start unloading things. What are we going to do in that situation, right? So just make sure that you think through, this is kind of get back to that negative test cases from that unit testing setups that we talked about at the beginning, right? Like, what happens if something breaks? What are we going to do? So just keep that in mind as part of the testing and the exception management process. And that's just from a business process of exceptions. But we have run across, historically it happened more frequently. Now we're getting a lot more better at this, detecting these, but you can get even data inconsistencies within the application itself. So what are we going to do when these situations happen? Make sure we have a plan in place. And I'm going to have a slide further on that introduce the concept of an order hospital, which might help in the processing of these trouble situations or these exceptions-based processing. Next topic here also is then just making sure that we have an increased focus on the reporting of these warehouses. So from a flow management perspective, for these complex warehouses, you're dealing with multiple orders consistently throughout the day at given times. And that warehouse needs to make sure that if there's a 10 a.m. shipment, that it's getting out the door on time, because again, it's going to be that snowball effect of if the first truck doesn't get out on time, pretty soon everything else for the rest of that day starts getting further and further behind. So a lot of these complex type implementations is that there's reporting requirements and those warehouse managers need to know exactly where they're at any given time throughout the day. So just making sure that we have reporting available for them so that they can make sure that their warehouse is running optimally. And that's both from, like, let's say from a outbound, like it might be from a processing perspective, it also might be from a labor planning perspective as well. And what I say here is a good starting point is typically setting up those data entities to get your work line details out to reporting systems. So that allows you to look at historical information as well as lets you plan for upcoming or future work that needs to be executed as well. And finally, final point here is do conduct time studies as well. So I mentioned this as part of that process testing, right? So identify scenarios, identify roles, figure out your timings on each of these different processes. Make sure you know what those baselines are before you go live in the system. So record what you need the system to be able to execute in, and then track within Dynamics 365 how long it's going to actually take you. A lot of times if you're coming from an unsophisticated warehouse, let's say it was paper-based and they didn't have to scan anything and inventory control was a second thought, now all of a sudden where you're having to scan every transaction in the system, it might end up taking a little longer in Dynamics 365. And that's not just an application issue, that's just a fact of if you're introducing this additional step in the process, it is going to take users a little longer. So make sure you understand how much longer that's going to take so that you can extrapolate out those results and make sure that you're doing proper labor planning around that. As I mentioned, in a complex warehouse, they might be 100% utilized in their labor force. So if you're adding an extra 10% time to each pick in the warehouse, extrapolate that out. What does that mean from a labor planning perspective? Do we need to hire additional people? How else could we redesign the process so that we can hit our target times with the labor force that we have, et cetera? And so the final big bullet point that I put here then is, because again, seeing this with customers, we get pulled into a lot of the escalation type issues, is that this just wasn't thought through before go live. And now we're back to that, snowball effect of, we've added these extra steps. It takes workers longer to do their job. Now all of a sudden we're not getting all of our orders out of the day, et cetera, or we're missing our cutoff time windows for trucks leaving the warehouse, et cetera. So make sure, don't wait until you go live to find out all of these issues are going to start popping up at go live, right? Make sure that you're out there, you know exactly how long it's going to take, that you're confident that the system is going to be able to keep up with the business, and you're not going to have these operational type issues after go live. So from an overall implementation perspective, again, this is actually an external consultant that we've worked with in the past that kind of put this together based off of some of the work that he'd done on some of our troubled implementations that we were getting pulled into. And this was the things that he basically brought to the table and said that this is what he most saw missing in our troubled implementations, right? Is that customers were not accurately or setting aside enough time for new SKU setups. So if you're in an industry or a customer that has a lot of new products, making sure that you, again, conduct time studies, figure out how long it takes to set up a new item, and that you're staffed adequately for that. Labor management reporting was missing. That flow management, so making sure that you have the right labor at the right place in the warehouse to make sure that everything is getting out the door on time. And then also this concept of what we call this order hospital, which is also kind of what I touched on previously around that exceptions management, or what do you do when things go wrong? That's basically what the order hospital concept is all about there. And so you really need to just industrialize all of those warehousing type operations in the warehouse by doing this. And so I'm going to go through I'm going to spend just like one slide on each of those different four topics here. So flow control from a reporting perspective, that might look differently for different industries. So in this example, this might be like I think this is a retail example here, right? So you have your daily schedule for this by store. So you know exactly from a retail perspective, here's the trucks that are going out for the day. This is where they're going. This is when they need to leave the warehouse. Based off of that schedule of these different trucks that might be leaving throughout the day, now we're setting up our schedule over on the right-hand side, and that's our schedule for hourly processes and where we need to be, right? So this would be that warehouse manager, are we on track? At any point in time during the day, they can go look and see, am I on track? Am I ahead or behind of where I need to be to make sure that everything's getting out of my warehouse on time today? Again, this would be another example of a flow management report then, right? So based off of my pick zones, I have my target. So I have my benchmarks. I know roughly how many license plates I can pick in an hour. I know based off of the total number of picks out there, I know by zone what everything needs to get done on any given day. And then I can see, am I over or under, and where do I need to deploy my workforce within my warehouse to make sure that things are going to get out the door on time. If I have a lot of zone C picks versus, zone A picks, I don't have any. I don't want somebody standing around in zone A doing nothing, right? I want to take that person, bring them out of zone A, put them into zone C so that I have additional pickers to help keep that on time and on track. We also have new tools available coming this fall timeframe. So starting in 10.0.13, there is a flighted feature for a workload visualization tool. So if in your test environments, if you don't have 10.0.13 installed yet, I encourage you to do so. And I just dropped the flight name there for you as well. So it's in preview mode right now, but you can feel free to get that set up and then and play with this new tool that's available for you as well. And then the other thing I mentioned is labor management reports. So this would be, again, this would be historical. This would be an example of a historical labor management report. You know, how efficient have my pickers been within the warehouse over the X given period of time? I can look at their utilization and their utilization really, and how well they've been doing over the last X period of time in this type of report. So that's historical reporting on labor. And then we also have the ability then, again, if we get those work line details out of the system, we then have the ability to do our future as well, right? So based off of the number of orders in the system and the open work that's out there, this is how much work is going to be out there in the warehouse. Do I have enough employees scheduled for these given days to make sure that I get all of this out the door on time? And then that final concept that I brought up is that order hospital, right? So this would be, in short, again, I'm cutting close on time here. So basically, in short, it dedicates resources to fixing problems in the warehouse. So instead of having to train all warehouse workers how to do all of those, exceptions management type processes, I mentioned I go to pick face and I'm supposed to pick 10 and there's only 9 there. Well, now what do I do, right? How do we train that user? Here are the 8 steps on the handheld device that you need to do in order to keep moving on with your day or to go try to find this product, et cetera. What the order hospital does is basically like if you run into any sort of issue at all as part of your day-to-day activities, just go dump it in the order hospital. We have resources, we have workers that's all they do is help fix problems, right? Okay, there were supposed to be 10, there's only 9. Okay, so I know we have 9 of them. Now I need to go find another one. It says that there's some in the bulk area. So I'm going to go pull some from the bulk area. I'm going to grab one more, complete this order, and then I'm also going to fill that pick face because there's an inventory discrepancy in the system. So these would be like your management type people or supervisor type folks within the warehouse that are just helping keeping the rest of the warehouse on time and on track, because once you start running into those issues, now we're back to that same problem where if you're not hitting benchmarks, things are starting to snowball on you. So just making sure that you free up your normal day-to-day workers, make sure that they're getting your orders out on benchmark time so that everything else is staying on track. And then we're also dealing with these problem orders as they come up as well then. So I was hopeful that we maybe have some additional time for questions. Unfortunately, I think I've run long on my presentation part of this again. So hopefully Zach and Nicole were able to help get your questions answered. If not, here's my contact information. So here's my email address. If you have anything else or any questions or concerns or issues, feel free to reach out to me. Other than that, I think we're all set. So back over to you, Evan.
Awesome. Thank you, Aaron. We would like to get your feedback on today's session. I've posted a link to a short survey in the Q&A panel. We value your feedback and welcome your input on how we did today and what you would like to see in future sessions. The survey score is on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest score possible, and we thank you for your participation in that. Again, as a reminder, the recording of today's session will be available on the TechTalk's Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. I'd like to extend a big thank you to our presenter, Aaron, and a thank you to our audience for logging in and joining us today. Please stay safe and have a great rest of your day or evening wherever you are. Goodbye.